Well, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar and thanks for attending. My name is Brian Schill and I'm the Executive Director for the Peters Township Chamber of Commerce. Today's presentation is sponsored and presented by Emily Emilius of Launch Consulting, and assisting her today is Micah Yarger from Yarger Professional Search. Good morning, Emily and Micah.
Good morning, Brian and everyone.
Good. Little Zoom 101 for everyone before we get started. This is being recorded, so it will be available for your viewing pleasure. If you have any questions today, we ask that you please use the Q&A button. That's the Q&A button rather than the chat. So that's all I have. So without further ado, Emily and Micah, take it away.
Okay, well, I'll get us started. And as Brian said, Micah is joining us today. Micah is not only a friend, but a colleague. He and I often collaborate with clients in the hiring process. So I'm glad to have him here as well to share his expertise. Today, it'll be focusing on the interview portion. So we are talking about how to hire top talent. And here are the 3 things that you will learn today. First is the 4 factors of fit. Second, how to use assessments in hiring. I find for a lot of my clients or just folks out there, their head spins when they start to be thinking about what assessment to use, how to use it properly, just telling the difference between them. So we'll spend time on that. And then Micah will be sharing best practices for interviewing in general and also behavioral interviewing. Like Brian said, feel free to use that Q&A button. I am happy to keep an eye on it. I'm sure Micah will, Brian will, Kelly will. And we have time at the end of this for Q&A, but I know for myself, I think Micah feels the same. We are happy to address questions as they come up. So feel free to ask away. A little bit about me. I know some of you attended last session. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. Welcome if this is your first time attending one of these in the series, but I am the CEO of Launch Consulting. I help organizations increase engagement, productivity, and profits by creating fulfilling work. When employees are fulfilled, they are more satisfied and more productive, so everyone wins. I am a SHRM SCP. If you're not familiar with that, that's the highest designation in HR. A certified Kolbe consultant will be talking about the Kolbe assessments as an option particularly for hiring, but for other uses as well. And I've been coaching and consulting for 14 years. So top talent is fun because it's, alliteration, and it's also kind of an HR jargony term. We throw that out a lot, but what does that really mean to hire top talent? Well, in my mind, it's consistently hiring high performers. That consistency part, I think, is the most important here, because sometimes we might get lucky and get a high performer here or there, but it's really about creating a process, a system that creates consistency and predictability and getting a good fit. There is no perfect anything. There's no perfect assessment. There's no perfect process. Human beings, things can get messy and it can be very difficult to be 100% accurate, but I can tell you that we can get very close. And most of the time there is room for improvement in hiring processes, particularly getting to that consistent mark. So I want to share with you the 4 factors of fit. I find that when folks are hiring, they tend to have more tunnel vision, and what they're thinking about is fit to job. Does this person fit this job? And while that's one factor of fit and a critical one, that's not the only factor of fit. Top talent, in order to be top talent and a high performer, must fit with the role, manager, team, and company. So as you can imagine, as we add these extra layers, this is why hiring consistently is so hard, because this is multifactorial and it's hard to keep it all in our heads. But I'll show you some solutions where it doesn't have to be hard, but this is where we really want to involve things like assessments so they can help us create some objectivity in the process. So let's walk through these 4 factors. So fit with role. That too can get a little muddy. Sometimes that's hard to define what that means. So the framework that I use actually lines up with the 3 parts of the human mind. So each one of us has 3 components to our mind and brains, actually. So there's what I call our what, our why, and our how. And this lines up with the cognitive part of the mind, the affective part of the mind, and what's called the conative part of the mind, or conation. That might be a new vocab word for you today. We'll come back to that in a minute. So I would say the majority of companies, HR professionals, just in general, people really only see the left 2. That's because likely they've never been told the existence of the third, which I'm excited to change for you today. But let's talk about the 2 on the left. They are a part of hiring for a role and fit with a role. So they have a part to play in this. But the problem is when we overfocus on them, we get in trouble, because we really have to have the 3 pieces here in total to make fit work. But let's talk about what. So cognition, or the cognitive part of the mind, is your skills, experience, training, intelligence. You know, we look to the resume oftentimes to tell us about this. We think about the interview, which Mike is going to share with us, to tell us more about this. And certainly skills and experience and training are oftentimes a prerequisite for doing a good job. I know I can't show up at the hospital and say, you know, I'm ready to be a surgeon and not have gone to medical school. So that's certainly, you know, kind of an obvious important piece. But research shows that intelligence is really only about 50% accurate in predicting job fit and job performance. So it has a limitation in terms of that predictive and prescriptive nature. In other words, the smartest person is not always the most successful. And while you have to go to medical school in order to be a surgeon, passing all the tests in medical school doesn't mean you're going to love being a surgeon or be a top performing surgeon. So there's a limitation in terms of where we can go from there. I also believe that skills is the easiest thing to solve for. You know, what we know is in flux, that can change over time. That's encouraging. So, you know, many of you may have been in a position where the candidate was so compelling for other reasons, but didn't have the kind of experience needed to do the job yet. So you were willing to invest in that person to train them into the role. I think that's, you know, especially if you can find those other qualities in them, that's perfectly acceptable if you have that time and commitment to invest in that person. So that's the what. Do they have the skills, or are they able to acquire the skills to do the job? So then there's their why. And Simon Sinek has certainly got us all thinking a lot more about our why. And this does matter because it is the spark that starts the fire. Last week, I spent a lot of time talking about engagement, and engagement is the difference between who's sitting on the bench and who's in the game. So the affective part of the mind is our motivation, our values, our preferences, our likes and dislikes, our beliefs, and the big one, personality, more that social style. So we do need to tap into the why of our potential candidates and the why in the role. Because if that's a misfit, then that person's going to not be motivated or struggle with motivation over time, which is clearly a problem. Personality, as being in this camp, is really something we have to be careful about putting stock in. Personality is consistently shown to really not be any kind of long-term predictor of job fit and job success. So I want to warn you of that big landmine, to use Micah's words that he'll share later, that personality can really be a total ruse, and we'll talk about that. The other thing is that your affect, your emotions, your passions and motivations, those change over time. That's true of your candidates too. So that's also why there's a hindrance there in terms of long-term prediction, because what motivates them today might be different tomorrow, next week, 2 years from now. And we have to recognize that that's in flux. So really we're capturing snapshots in time, not long-term data about that individual. So that brings me to a person's how. So sometimes I hear folks lump this into the affect or personality category, but this is completely distinctive. In fact, it's actually a completely separate part of your physical brain. So in the back of your brain, in the occipital lobe, is where you have striving instincts. So again, this is called conation. And the best way that I like to describe it is your innate problem-solving method. So to use this framework, we can have two candidates, for example, with the exact same or very similar skills and experience. Maybe both have an MBA, both have 15 years business experience. They can both be very motivated by similar things. They love serving people. They geek out about finances. So similar what and why, but they may have completely different ways of getting to the same result. So if you have kids, you can absolutely know what I'm talking about. Same household, same parents, but the way they do homework might be radically different. The way they approach house rules, the way they keep their room. So that's an example of our how, that actually each one of us is born with this problem-solving method, or MO. And interestingly enough, unlike the other parts of the mind, this never changes. So this innate way of doing things, taking action, get results, becomes a non-negotiable when we're getting that fit right, because this aspect of that candidate or employee is not something you're going to train them into or out of. It is not something that's going to fluctuate with time. The other reason that this is so important to understand and clearly identify is that jobs come with expectations as to how they are to be performed. So, we don't tend to say, accountant, any old way you want to do that accounting, you just go right ahead, right? We say, no, you need to be detailed, you need to be accurate, you need to be thorough, methodical, risk mitigative, right? Those are how terminologies, not motivations and not skills. It's a problem-solving approach. So hopefully that makes sense, but I want to actually give you some examples of how we do that for clients, and hopefully that'll clarify that for you. So as I've mentioned last time and briefly mentioned today, we utilize the Kolbe assessments to help us do this, because first off, we need objectivity here. Secondly, as I've said before, there are so many layers to this, it'll make your head spin. So we need to utilize good data so we can make good decisions. But this is what we capture when we are looking to fill a role in terms of the how piece. Again, we have to put it all together, but in many ways, we really need to start here. How will someone need to operate, not just feel or not just know, but how do they need to operate to get this job done well? We don't want this to be something that the candidate can do. We want it to be something that they do naturally. Like our moms told us, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? So just because they can doesn't mean they should. So let me give you one more example of how you can incorporate this into your process. I'd love to talk to you about what those assessments would look like and show you some more depth in that. But really what we're trying to get at is when we're advertising for the job opening, when we're creating job descriptions, when we're interviewing, when we're evaluating candidates, we need to be using how language. How will this person operate? How does this person need to perform to do this job well? So as I read these, think about how it doesn't matter if you're introverted or extroverted, if you have 10 years experience or 2 years experience, that's somewhat irrelevant to these kinds of descriptors. So this person will work sequentially, systematize processes, diagram steps and procedures, bring order out of chaos, organize information and materials, bring closure to projects, provide structured systems, chart and graph progress. So really challenge yourself and your team to be thoughtfully adding in how language, not just personality type factors, motivational type factors, and skill level factors. Okay, so the second aspect of fit is fit with manager. I'm sure you all are very well aware of all of the statistics about, people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. I will tell you, I easily speak with a person each week that is leaving a job because of the manager, not because it was a misfit with the job itself. So that's a very real thing. And like everything else, it can be tricky to figure out just in our heads. So that's where we do want to look to objective measures to help us make this fit right. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind, and it's the 3 C's. So oftentimes what we're looking to avoid is a clone and a conflict. One caveat is sometimes cloning is okay, but for the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to talk about cloning and conflict being something to avoid, and instead we're looking at complement. So what I'm focusing on here is that how piece, that problem solving part of the mind, but this can apply to the other components of the framework as well. So why is cloning bad? And what I mean by cloning is, getting a similar type MO, a similar type individual who solves problems in the same way. Well, those people might get along well, but what we start creating is groupthink, where they might, be getting along, but they start to go too far in the wrong direction because there's no devil's advocate. So from an organizational perspective, that's not great. There's usually not a lot of growth happening because, again, no one's encouraging diversity of thought there. Conflict, that one's pretty opposite, but what do I mean by conflict? Well, oftentimes when we hear the word conflict, we're thinking interpersonal conflict, maybe a personality conflict. But I want to introduce to you the concept of a conative conflict that actually, when not recognized as such, usually becomes an interpersonal conflict. So that means people that have such different and separate problem-solving approaches that it is just very difficult for them to operate together. So let me give you a real world example of that. So we know that part of the population by nature simplifies. They don't need a lot of information or maybe even any information in order to act. There's another part of the population that needs information in detail in order to take action. This isn't a values or preferences things, it's actually a need. When that need is not satisfied, that person will shut down and stop being productive, essentially. So I had a client in Atlanta. It was actually the business owner was a financial advisor, and he had his son join the firm. And he was letting me know when I got into the process that he was getting ready to fire his own son because he was wired to be a simplifier bottom liner, and his son was wired to be the detailed individual. And what that translated into was the gentleman, the father said to me, I can't stand how my son disrespects me so much that he questions every decision I make. I'm the one who has the experience here. He should trust that I know what I'm doing. I don't need an FBI interrogation every time I lay out a new idea. So if you hear what's happening, that really wasn't likely a trust or respect issue or lack thereof. It was just two people operating in completely different ways. But when we don't know that how exists as a whole component of our relationships and brains and ways of working, then when there's differences, people interpret that as a personal assault. So in that instance, that individual thought, my son is doing something to me, where in reality, that his son was actually highly engaged, which is why he was asking questions. So what we're working towards is setting up a complementary relationship where they're not redundant of each other, they're not conflicting of each other, but that there's enough of a difference so that we're picking up a diversity of problem-solving approaches, but they're able to encourage one another to grow in different ways, and go a little bit outside of the box, again, without being so far that we really are unproductive in that situation. The assessments that we use, the Kolbe system, actually, as a rule, when we're hiring and establishing the needs of the role, we always factor in the manager or managers. I'm not aware of another system that does that. If you know of one, I'd love to hear about it. But that's really important. We can't look at the job in isolation, because that job doesn't happen independent of that manager's influence, and frankly, MO. So third factor of fit is fit with team. Synergy is a word that we throw out there a lot, but I don't often see it actually defined in measurable terms. So synergy is simply the diversity of problem-solving methods. So the most synergistic teams are ones that approach problem solving from multiple angles. Again, if we think about it, if we break synergy, so examples of non-synergy, if you will, are cloning, where everybody solves problems in the same way. That creates groupthink. To give you another example, there was a leadership team at a very reputable organization, international organization, that was the picture of diversity, rightly so, in every other way that we think about it, but they all solve problems in the same way. And for them, it was to get lots of detail. And because everybody was piling on, they never arrived at a decision. And when I say that, I mean, I've checked in with them, it's about 2 years later, and there's still no decision made on a critical decision that they were considering. Because what would happen was, anytime they would start solving one problem, a question would come up, and they thought, well, we need a new meeting for that. We need a new agenda for that. We need to do another exploratory period for that. And as you can imagine, you know, it just constantly kept evolving with more information, and they never arrived at a decision. So that's the problem when we don't have that synergy, when we don't have that diversity. Or what can happen is we get polarization, where you have differences, but you have no one in between. So you have maybe the sales department and the engineering department. And many of you can probably appreciate that, where the sales department and the engineering department are at odds with each other, because the sales department, you know, maybe goes out and makes these big commitments that are, you know, maybe a bit ambitious, and the engineering department is frustrated that, you know, here's all the reasons why that won't work, and that's totally unrealistic given our time frame and budget, and that's where we just get these us versus them, and that's, if you've ever been in that kind of culture, that's really frustrating to live through. So we actually strive to create a bell curve effect, where we have a lot of people in the middle, a lot of people who are very accommodative, not in a personality way, but in terms of how they problem solve. And then we have some people on those opposite ends, but with that big buffer in between. So here's something that we do for our clients to actually make this palatable and objective and measurable. So on the left-hand side, this is basically a heat map, if you will, of problem-solving methods amongst a team. You can see that we're looking for that bell curve ideally. And this is an actual client of ours. This is their team. And we were able to say, here's where you're a little overweighted in certain areas, and where you have some missing or close to missing problem-solving methods. So as they're hiring, they can be thinking about, how does this person actually add or take away from synergy? Which, speaking of, on the right-hand side, this is actually an example of candidate grades. So the candidates you can see listed there, these are candidates for a position of CEO. On the right-hand side, that graphic is what we're aiming for. This is the ideal operating method of the role, based off of the role requirements and that manager. And then you can see under SI, that's the synergy indicator. So we actually say to our clients, here's the effect of this individual on the synergy of the group. So when we're hiring them, we're not just matching to the role, we're not just matching to the manager, but we're also hopefully picking up more diversity in problem solving methods so we can make that whole team better and then that department better. So they can have a neutral effect, really no difference, negative effect, or a positive effect. This helps make these decisions so much clearer. It's just really helpful. Again, good data and good decisions out. So the fourth factor of fit is fit with the company. And this is where we really do want to understand, does this candidate's mission, vision, and values align with the organization's? You know, they can have the perfect how, the perfect problem solving method, but if they don't believe in what our company stands for, then we've got problems, right? And then, you know, thinking again about that larger picture of operational diversity of our organization as a whole. You know, do we have people who approach problem solving in all different ways in our company, or are we really deeply entrenching ourselves into one way is the right way and therefore actually hurting ourselves as a company? Because I will tell you, those that lack operational diversity are doomed to stagnancy, because without outside perspective, without devil's advocate, you will struggle to make any kind of progress or decisions. So the way to think about it is we want unity in mission, diversity in approach. Unity in mission, diversity in approach. Okay, so let's talk about how to use assessments in hiring before I turn it over to Micah. We're gonna play some fun, hopefully fun. Admittedly, and Micah knows this, I really geek out over assessments. So, but to me, the integrity of the work that we do for our clients is based off of, you know, the integrity of the tools that we provide for them. So we're gonna play some fact versus fiction of assessments and do some myth busting here. So a fiction that I often hear is all assessments measure the same thing. And that comes from people hearing the word assessment and immediately associating the word personality. And that's a fair association because a little fun fact, there's over 800 psychological assessments out there. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed at making a choice, you have good reason to feel that way. And all of them, but the Kolbe tools that we use, measure some aspect of personality or intelligence, and likely the majority of them are in that personality camp. So it can feel like they're all personality assessments, but they're not. There are some distinctions. However, I will say the semantics, the words that are used, can be incredibly confusing and frustrating. So a caution is, don't take the marketing of the assessment companies for granted. You really got to dig a little deeper, because they might say one thing on their website and really their more dry statistical report is actually going to get to the heart of the matter. And I suggest going one level deeper to get to that, or, you know, we do that on behalf of our clients. So the fact is that each assessment can only measure one aspect at a time. There are some assessment companies that offer various assessments that can get at different things, but they really can only do one at a time. And each assessment is only measuring one aspect of those three parts of the mind. And Kolbe happens to be the only assessment that measures that cognitive part. Okay, another fiction for you. All assessments can be used to evaluate candidates. This is a big landmine. And I want to be careful to say that I am not offering legal advice, and I certainly suggest that you go back and talk to your legal counsel or legal department. But I have seen some organizations commit this error unknowingly. And I think if they knew that, you know, the legal implications, they certainly would not have made that decision. Of the over 800 assessments that are available, only a handful of them are EEOC compliant and even intended for use in hiring. So watch out for that one. For example, DISC, Myers-Briggs, StrengthsFinders, they are not intended for use in hiring, and they are not EEOC compliant. So really quickly, what does EEOC compliance require? One, it has to be non-discriminatory. That might seem obvious, but I will tell you there's quite a robust debate in the legal community about whether or not personality assessments are non-discriminatory. And I'm saying personality, which is one aspect of the mind. The other thing that it has to have is it has to be job specific. So what that means is you can't just look at the peg. you have to relate it back to the hole that you're trying to fill. So all that work that we just did in establishing the needs of the role, the needs next to the manager, the needs of the team, the needs of the organization, that's really necessary. Maybe, that can look different. It doesn't always have to be that way to qualify for the standard, but you have to have some justification for the reason why we want this quality is because we've established that the role itself needs it. So we again accomplish that by first measuring the needs of the hole we're trying to fill before we go assess candidates. If you're currently using a process where you're only assessing candidates, that might be something you want to review. And we can certainly help you do that. Okay, another fiction. If an assessment is popular, it must be good. Well, some of the most well-known assessments have the weakest validity and reliability. What is validity? Validity is basically how good is it at predicting the future? How accurate is it? And usually if you're using an assessment, particularly in hiring, you're using it because you want to know, is this person going to be a fit in the future? So accuracy for future is really important, particularly in this context. What does reliability mean? Well, reliability is the consistency of results over time. So if I test you today and I test you 10 years from now, how different or similar are your results going to be? Well, I'll throw out some interesting facts. If you've heard of predictive index, it has predictive in the name, right? So we would think it's probably really predictive. Well, its predictive validity on its best day is 19%. So that means it is 19% accurate in predicting job fit. So the tools that we use are 82% accurate on their own. So that's a really big difference. And a lot of tools don't even measure for that. So you got to watch out. Reliability. So StrengthsFinders expires in 2 months. 2 months. So that means the threshold of consistency is not met after 2 months. So what it's measuring is just influx and changing over time. So that's more of what we call a snapshot in time. The assessments that we use, they're still deemed reliable after 20 years. I'm not aware of an assessment that measures anywhere even close to that because they've already failed the threshold. So from my research, all of the personality instruments that I've looked to have failed the reliability measure after 1 year. Okay, I see something in the chat, so I'm gonna, oh, okay, so Brian's just connecting. Awesome. So really, you do have to look under the hood when it comes to assessments, and just the fact that it's a popular name really doesn't mean that it's gonna get you the results that you're looking for. Okay, fiction. All assessments results are good for a lifetime. They do not change. Well, like we just addressed, personality and skills are constantly in flux. So if you're using one of those kinds of instruments, you really have to be prepared to keep retesting people. And there's time and expense to that, as you can imagine. And then you have to be prepared to make different decisions. And I really don't see that happening in practice. I don't see people using DISC every single year, for example, which is what would be appropriate given when DISC expires. I don't see people using StrengthsFinders every 2 months. Myers-Briggs actually expires like within weeks, if not sooner. So the reality of how those tools need to be used and how they're often used, I find a real disconnect there. And the issue is that, we're talking about consistently predicting high performers, and that to me is counterproductive towards that end. And we're dealing with people's lives and careers. And we really owe them making decisions about that with good data. So what's compelling about your striving instincts, not personality, but your how, is that those are actually stable for a lifetime. So as I mentioned before, it's not something you're going to train people into or out of. It's really a non-negotiable both for them and for you. Okay, last thing I want to share with you before turning it over to Micah is when to use an assessment in hiring. I hear this question a lot. And the answer is early. What happens to a lot of clients or companies that I hear about is that they're using it later. So they might wait until the final 3 to 5 candidates are identified and then use their assessment. I typically hear people doing that for cost savings, cost effectiveness, that there's a cost, and there is, to assessing candidates. So they try to minimize that cost. But here's the problem with that. I would argue that the cost, if we broke down the hourly rate of all of the people that are involved in your hiring process, it's very popular to do panel interview style, particularly for someone who's more advanced in your company. All of the people on that panel are spending time with people that could potentially have already been eliminated from the process. So the cost of their time, of their effort, to me, is so much greater than the much, much smaller cost of establishing very early on if that person is worth moving forward in the process. The second issue is emotional attachment. I've been in a situation where my clients have waited till the final round to assess candidates, and it is a very difficult and frankly awkward conversation to tell them that that candidate that they fell in love with isn't a good fit for the job. And what happens is, rather than listening to the data at that point, the objective, predictive, proven data, they end up justifying why they're willing to make the concessions for that person to work out. So just to protect ourselves from getting emotionally attached to someone who really isn't a good fit, and it wouldn't be good for them, wouldn't be good for the company, I suggest assessing candidates usually after that initial resume review or phone screening. Before they go any further, you really need to establish that makes sense. So determine the fit of how that problem-solving method first, then you can invest in the why and the what pieces. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Micah.
All right, thank you so much, Emily, and I appreciate everyone welcoming me here today and letting me be part of this. And so, my name is Micah Yarger, and I'm principal of Yarger Professional Search. And I've been recruiting for nearly a decade now. And a couple years ago, I founded my own recruiting firm and started doing permanent placement of candidates. So that's what I focus on, is permanent placement and full-time candidates, more of a recruiting firm than a staffing firm. There's a little bit of a difference there. But so in my line of work, I've done a lot of interviewing, and I have done a lot of coaching of hiring managers, and I've done a lot of coaching of candidates. I've been on both sides of that table quite a bit. But when it comes to conducting an interview, there's a lot of information out there, and there are a lot of techniques out there on how to conduct an interview. So I just wanted to share a little bit with you today on what I feel are the best practices and what techniques might give you the best opportunity to make a good hire. And I would start with the caveat that this is really only useful information if you understand a lot of what Emily has explained. It's hard to, a good interview won't fix you selecting the wrong candidate that's not the right fit, where the how isn't there. So that needs to be in place. You need to understand what you're looking for. But a good interview can help, can complement that process. And if you've ever conducted an interview and made a hire of a candidate, and after the interview you felt like this is going to be an excellent candidate, this is going to work out great, and then the new employee joins your company, and you're really just at a place where you're just not getting the performance out of that candidate. They don't have the knowledge maybe that you had thought that they would have. Whatever it might be, just the interview didn't seem to match the performance and didn't seem to match what you got. You feel like the interview was aced and the actual job performance didn't meet that. A lot of times that can be a result of Maybe the individual was just a great interviewer, and maybe they're able to come in and talk the talk. They've maybe been through a lot of interviews, they're comfortable in that place. But for some reason during that interview, we didn't really get to their actual competence in the position. We didn't uncover whether or not they were going to be, a high performer. They were going to be a good fit for your job. So you might be using the wrong technique. There are several out there. You have a traditional interview, which you'll have people, that'll ask, why are you interested in this job? Why are you a good fit for this job? Why are you leaving your last position? What's your 5-year plan? You can hear a lot of these kind of big open-ended questions. You're giving your candidate a lot of space to formulate an answer and to respond to you, perhaps how they think you want them to respond. So you've got a traditional interview. You've got a job simulation. Maybe you'll have someone, you're hiring a writer, and so you'll have them write a piece for you. Those can have a place, but those aren't really the end all be all as a job simulation. A lot of companies will conduct like a casual interview. They'll take them out to lunch and they'll talk about everything but the job, and they'll just try to get to know them as a person. That might have a place too, but I don't think that that's your best method to really make a good hiring decision. So where I recommend to go is a behavioral based interview. And there are a lot of groups out there that talk about this. I know that DDI is a big one that does targeted selection and will teach how to do behavioral based interviewing. But this is a very popular, with HR professionals who really want to conduct an interview to get to the actual job performance and job experience that a candidate has. The difference being that we aren't asking theoretical questions, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but we are asking for real life situations. We are asking for real life experiences. We're having the candidate describe these things to us in interview. The method that you use to kind of get to that point is you first need to determine what are the aspects of the job that are going to be important. What are the things that you need to find out? Is communication a key aspect of the position? Is teamwork? Is this person going to need to have experience resolving conflict? There are a lot of things and a lot of aspects that you may need to hone in on in your interview to determine whether a candidate's going to be a good fit. Once you have those various aspects set up, then you will want to create interview questions and an interview guide and kind of a maybe somewhat of a script for yourself to really keep you on track during an interview. So the difference in how you maybe used to ask questions, if you in the past, if you've asked some of these questions about say it's about conflict resolution, you might ask, are you good at resolving conflict? It's kind of an open-ended, it's a leading question. And, in your head, you just want to hear them, talk about resolving conflict, but you might ask it in a way that you're really kind of leading them to the answer you want to get, or you are leaving it open-ended for them to respond and give you the answer that they think you want. A better way to ask a question about resolving conflict, perhaps it's with customers that you need to know about. You might ask a question like, tell me a time when you needed to resolve a conflict between a customer and one of the members of your sales team, or the customer and your customer service group. You ask a specific targeted question that causes the candidate to respond with a real life situation that will have a result, an action, the entire story within their answer. The reason we do this, the reason you want to ask situational questions, to ask specific questions, is if we are trying to find out how, how someone is with conflict resolution, we want to hear them talk about a real life circumstance. It's a lot harder to come up with that on the spot and to fake that than it is an open-ended question. If you ask me, so tell me, how do you handle conflict resolution? I can respond to that with really anything I want. I can tell you that I respond with conflict resolution by bringing both parties together at a table, having them look at each other, and I can describe the most impressive conflict resolution scene that you could possibly imagine, and you would come out of that thinking that I'm pretty good with conflict resolution. Whereas if you ask me to describe a situation between a customer and a member of my team, or a customer and a member of the customer service group, all of a sudden, okay, I have to give something specific here. If I am going to try to do that on the fly and I don't have a real good example of it, that's going to show. And that will tell you, okay, he's not able to really create and tell a story, or he hasn't done this enough that he has actual real life examples of conflict resolution. Is this someone we really want in a position that's handling conflict resolution? So that is the progression, going from the traditional way or the casual way of interviewing people, where you're giving open-ended questions, leading questions, and the behavioral based interviewing technique, where you're actually getting the real experience from the candidate of real life situations. So as I'd mentioned, some of the bad interview techniques: open-ended questions. I gave an example of that. Asking theoretical or non-verifiable questions. If you're asking questions that you can't go and verify in another way. In other words, perhaps you're asking them to describe their sales. You want to ask specific sales questions. You don't want to ask them, did you meet your goals? Yeah, I met my goals. Okay. It would be better to ask them, what are the numbers? What were the goals, and how did you meet them? Tell me about a time that you had a goal that you did not meet. Ask questions that will help them to describe how they've handled adversity. You want to ask some more pointed, verifiable questions than just kind of giving them an open door to give you a metric that you really can't. A lot of times you'll hear people describe their greatest strengths. My greatest strength is that I'm an awesome communicator. That's non-verifiable. You cannot verify. Maybe they're a good communicator in an interview, but perhaps you need them to be a good communicator, by conducting a meeting or conducting a large Zoom conference. There could be a lot of different ways that they're a good or a bad communicator. So you want to stick to asking verifiable questions, and leading questions. I probably should have added that as a bullet point here too. Asking questions where you're giving them the answer in the questions. Maybe your job environment is very busy. Maybe you need to wear a lot of different hats. People are really hopping all the time. They're in and out. There's a lot of things going on. You got to spin 2 or 3 plates. If you ask a question where you describe that entire scene and then ask them if they would like that, they are going to feel like they need to agree with that. So, and that's extremely common. That's very, very common, because in the interviewer's mind, they're trying to knock that out. I hired someone who didn't like the busy nature of this business, so I want to knock that out real quick. But a better way to approach that would be to ask them about times when they had multiple priorities. Tell me about a time where you had 2 conflicting priorities with tight deadlines. How did you manage the process, and what was the result? That's a great interview question, and that'll go a lot farther for you. So we're going to move on to some, interviewing landmines, and I'll just end this quickly here. There are things that you want to steer clear from asking personal questions. Using multiple interview techniques with different candidates. You have candidate A and you do a casual interview. You have candidate B, you do a behavioral. You have candidate C, you do a simulation. All of your interviews need to be exactly the same. They need to mirror each other so that everyone has a fair situation going in. And then also not having proper documented evaluation system in place. You need to be able to determine how people win or lose these interviews, how one is rated higher than another. You want to have that documented and in place. And again, that's more of a legal thing, just so that you don't get accused of creating an unfair situation for one person who's interviewed and evaluating a different candidate with a different set of criteria. Everyone needs to have the same criteria. But yeah, thank you for your time today. There are a couple ways to get in touch with me if you need any recruiting help. I am Micah Yarger on LinkedIn, so that's the best way. Connect with me on LinkedIn. You can call me at the number printed there, that's fine, or shoot me an email at micah@yargerprofessionalsearch.com. Thank you for your time, everybody.
And if you'd like to connect with me, I invite you to reach out on LinkedIn to me personally. You can also follow Launch Consulting. We have a company page where we put out lots of great advice and how-tos and content there. If you want to go deeper, if you're interested in some of the tools that I shared with you today, if you're now asking questions about the tools that you're already using or want to know how that fits in, it's not necessarily one or the other. You can use these tools in combination with each other if chosen well. So schedule a discovery call. That's no obligation. There's no cost to do that, but we can just go a bit deeper and really determine if it makes sense to work together or not. So you can do that at our website, launchconsulting.io. I also want to just share with all of you an invitation. I'm really excited about a group program that we are launching in April, and it is to be an ongoing resource for business leaders like you who crave fulfillment, and I would say deserve fulfillment in your job, because if you're exhausted, you don't have the energy to lead others either. So, it's really important that you have the alignment of your what, your why, and your how in your job, and then have those resources to do that for others. So we have this resource really tailored fit for, I believe, all of you. And we have a special offer. So if that's of interest, I'd love for you to reach out and we can have another conversation about what that could look like for you. And with that, we will open it up. We've got a couple minutes here to some questions and answers, and we are happy to be in the hot seat here.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Just a couple things I did want to mention. Let's see what we got here. The fit. I thought was really interesting, and because there's a lot of things that most of us probably have not seen before, but the how and how important it is. But one of the biggest things was I've done probably every assessment out there, as most of us have done, and as I think about it now, I think maybe it was more for fun. Are you an ENFJ? Or whatever you are, or doing your DISC profile. I've done predictive index. The big thing is no one can figure me out. So
I'd like to take a crack at it, Brian.
I'd love to do the Kolbe. So no, it's all good. So I just want to mention that. And then the one thing I had for Micah is I'm like, what? I don't get it. What do you mean I can't ask personal questions? That's my life. Hey, how the kids, where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to high school? Did you go to college? I guess now I'm going to have to rethink everything, so.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's one of those things, people who are used to networking and communicating and having those interpersonal conversations, they can be extremely well intended. But if they show up in an interview, you can open yourself up to some liability there.
Yeah. I had to laugh. I don't know if you've ever seen the Progressive insurance commercials, now you're like your parents. But my kids, it was so funny because we saw the one and my wife just looked at me and shook her head. And then she texted all the kids and said, you got to watch this because It's the one where, the server doesn't, you don't need to know everything about the server or something like that, because usually when I'm talking to the servers or whoever I am, it's,
Right.
if you're really interested in people, you just have a tendency to, to do that. So I like the idea of the script, which would be essential for someone like me, to make sure I stay to the script, because otherwise, just through human nature, some people would be more, adapt to do that. So, but I wanted to note those couple things. So I thank you very much. I don't see anything in the Q&A at this point. How about some closing arguments from the both of you?
Well, I'll just say, if something comes up as you process the conversation today, you know how to get a hold of each of us. And I know we're more than happy to have a private conversation. So feel free, take advantage of connecting with us in those various ways, whatever you feel most comfortable with. And we're happy to continue the conversation in that way.
Cool.
Right. Yeah. If you're searching for a candidate that you're really having a hard time finding, or a position you're really having a hard time filling, I'm happy to have those conversations anytime, even if it's just to give you my thoughts or give you my opinion, and reach out anytime about recruiting. It's my favorite thing to talk about.
And I will say, please join us next week, because I'll be talking about how to diagnose and solve people problems. And that's a biggie, definitely. So we'll have a clear framework for how to deal with that, which often feels like a big black hole. So please join us again next week.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Well, thanks, Emily and Mike. I really appreciate it. And again, I just want to mention too, Emily has her remaining session next Wednesday, the 24th at 10 a.m. And it is how to diagnose and solve people problems. So we're looking forward to that one. Please feel free to register if you have not already done so. And you can do that at www.ptcoc.org. So just want to let everybody know the chamber is open for business. The offices are available by appointment only, please. And if you need to get a hold of us, email is probably the best, and info@ptcoc.org, or you can call us at 724-941-6345. Always take a look out for our Facebook page. We're very active there, so you can find out what's going on as well. But thanks again, Emily, Micah, Launch Consulting, and to all of you. So stay well and have a great day. Thank you.